All right. Hi, and welcome to Bread Reviews, number 24 with Justin Clark. Thanks for joining me, Justin.
Thanks, Cory, for having me. It's been a while since we've done this. Very excited to be back. We're inching ever closer to the 1-year anniversary of Red Reviews. The first episode, I think, went out like June 22nd last year or something like that.
Okay, nice.
So we probably recorded it around this time last year.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a bit of and probably by the time this one comes out, it might be that. So, or I'm not sure exactly when, but yeah, so we've been doing this for a year. It's really, really great. I love doing this show, and I look forward to sort of kind of starting back up the schedule and doing more episodes. So,
yeah, for sure. Hopefully, we've both had kind of busy weeks the last few weeks, so hopefully things will slow down a little bit and we can focus on the show a little bit. And
yeah, absolutely. So I think this is episode 24.
Yep.
And so this episode tonight will be another sort of 2-book episode where we sort of be talking about 2 books, and generally I think having a discussion of these sort of 2 books, but also sort of a broader discussion about sort of the history and theory of anarchism broadly. So The 2 books that we'll be discussing tonight are The Conquest of Bread by Piotr Kropotkin,
nice.
And Anarchism and Other Essays by Emma Goldman.
Ah, nice.
And
that's the book that got me into anarchism.
Great. So when we pivot to talk about Goldman, we'll put a pin in that. We'll come back to that.
Okay.
So, because my introduction to anarchist theory was Emma Goldman too.
Nice.
And so the first book we'll talk about is The Conquest of Bread, written by Piotr Kropotkin. We talked about his book Mutual Aid last time, yep. And that was a very, I think, fruitful discussion. The Conquest of Bread was sort of written around the same time that he wrote Mutual Aid. It was this sort of period of about 10 or so years. I think he might have written most of it when he was living in London. And so part of it was originally the book was serialized and published in a London newspaper, a London magazine rather. And, this is the book where the term bread tube comes from. Yep. So when you hear the term bread tube, this is the book. This is the theory. This is the book where the bread tube thing comes from. Because the nickname for the book is also, it's either you call it The Conquest of Bread, which is the title, the official title. But a lot of people just call it the bread book.
Right. Yeah.
And so what makes Piotr Kropotkin's anarchist communism different than, say, sort of anarcho-capitalism, especially anarcho-capitalism, or, Marxism-Leninism, is basically this commitment to a sort of convergence of 2 strains of sort of anarchist thought that kind of come to one. So anarchism, does have this, at least in Kropotkin's sense, and especially in Emma Goldman's sense, this commitment to individual rights.
Yeah.
And the importance of the individual in society, but not in a sort of, not in the anarcho-capitalist kind of way, not the Ayn Rand kind of way, where it sort of comes off and eventually it's just sort of solipsism or narcissism or egoism, but rather a commitment to individual rights, and that individual rights are protected and in many ways strengthened by creating a society from the bottom up that makes sure that people's material needs are met.
Yeah.
So, Kropotkin was very critical of a lot of political thinkers, whether they were Marxists or not, who sort of had these sort of highfalutin ideas about how they wanted to do society. And his whole thing was look, those are all wonderful, but if people can't eat, then that doesn't really mean all that much.
That's right.
He's you can't really make a revolution work without bread. And that's kind of the thing he comes back to, is if you look at workers' revolts, whether it's the Paris Commune or others, these workers' revolts often fail largely as a result of there not being any food, not there being any bread.
Yeah. The legislators sit in their offices debating about what they're going to do while people are starving in the streets.
That's right. And so what he talks a lot about is, and the way that he frames it is very interesting because, in Marxist theory, revolution has a very specific meaning, right? Mm-hmm. But in Kropotkin's theory of revolution, he often refers to it as the social revolution. He'll often call it that, the social revolution. So he's not just talking about it's not just sort of like a society, like if you think of Marxism, right, where it's like you have the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, and you have the workers.
Right.
And the goal of a proletarian revolution in Marxism, dialectically, is to move it this way, where the workers are in power and the bourgeoisie are the ones who are sort of oppressed by the state. Like that's, in order to create a worker society in this sort of Marxist-Leninist framework, you have to build a society, a state essentially, that will protect the workers and will essentially penalize the people at top, who originally at the top, who are now the sort of the ones that the state wields power against in service of the workers, right?
Right.
And Kropotkin sort of doesn't accept that framework at all.
Right.
His whole thing is basically like, that just exchanges one form of authority or authoritarianism for another.
Yeah.
And so his argument rather is to have a social revolution which is rooted in, and quite frankly, rooted in localism. And so this is something that would come to the forefront, years later with people like Murray Bookchin and others, where it's sort of talking about the value of building smaller societies, sustainable societies upon shared values. And so I think that's kind of the difference, is that social revolution is broader than just, changing the dynamics of power.
Right.
Right. It's actually about sort of questioning the role of power in and of itself. And saying that we actually, instead of doing this sort of from the top down, it has to be from the bottom up. And the only, I think that's great in theory. I guess my only criticism of it is that, the problem with having a revolution like that is that he's never very clear about how a revolution would look.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. I think he often, he talks about, expropriation, and he talks about various things like housing and whatnot, but he doesn't actually say, he doesn't talk about the building of that dual power, that building of that structure.
Yeah, Kropotkin never wrote a what is to be done.
Right.
It was not like Lenin where it's you got to do this, 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 and this. It was never, and, I think that is, a weakness of Kropotkin, but I also think in some respects it can be a strength in the sense that there's a certain level of, flexibility and adaptability to his ideas, which I think are why they've been so, popular for so long. I also think that he has a real, and again, I still think his connection to science and thinking like a scientist is such a huge component of his revolutionary thinking, because he really, in Conquest of Bread, he sort of breaks down okay, well, this is how we would, and in a lot of ways, his arguments about how we would build a sort of revolutionary society echo what Engels would write in Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, which we covered on a previous episode. And Engels' whole thing is you build up a productive capacity enough, and then people's material needs will be met because production will have then met what is enough to meet everybody's needs. And then you have the revolution in which those systems, instead of being run by capitalists, are run by the workers. And then the surpluses are then used in a rational, planned way in order to meet people's basic needs.
Yeah.
It's a very big picture, right? Kropotkin so that's the macro. Engels is looking at it sort of a macro level. Again, Kropotkin's coming back down to that micro. And he's sort of saying, okay, well, if we're going to build a better society, these are some of the things we're going to need to do. We're going to need to think about how will industrial output or any kind of how will that, he doesn't think about production in the abstract. He thinks about it very much in the concrete, where his whole thing is well, if you're going to have this many people in a suif then you need to have this much bread, you need, this many clothes, or this many shirts. This is where
he's talking about the printing press and how you have to, if you want to use a printing press, you have to learn how to use a printing press yourself and do it yourself.
Yes, it's, he thinks like a scientist. It comes down to this sort of, and so, he also sort of argues for, this sort of, anarcho-communist society where, it's like Engels, he's making the argument that like this industrial society produces so much and the distribution is so bad that like if you could retrofit our societies to meet need rather than profit, then we could have more than enough.
Yeah.
But then he also just goes into like the issues of distribution,
which is, that's kind of like something that you'll hear with a lot of anarchists now is that when people say, well, how are you going to produce, say, pharmaceuticals? Well, the people who currently produce pharmaceuticals will continue to do that. We'll just distribute it differently. The ownership will be of the people. It won't be the profiteering capitalists. Right.
But the thing, too, is that he's also very critical of the role of centralization itself.
Yes. Yeah.
So he will acknowledge full well that, whereas Engels or Marx, they're not necessarily against the centralization of production, because then you have that, you build that productive capacity, and then you have that sort of proletarian revolution where you set up the semi-state of socialism, right? Because that in Marxist theory, like socialism is it is the transition from capitalism to communism, right? And so, that's, I think, the big thing is that like with Marxism, there's a lot more clear delineated steps of like you get to this and then you go to this and then you go like whereas with Kropotkin, it's more of like, instead of like working from a place, like Marxists often work from a place and then get somewhere, he does it the other way around.
Yeah,
he sort of comes up with like, where it's like, I'm going to come up with the ideal society. I'm going to think about that. Okay. Now I'm going to work backwards to figure out, okay, well, how could I make that happen?
Right.
And I think that's kind of like, in some respects, I think a little bit of the difference. But yeah, I think that, the thing that I find, like I said, what I find very rewarding about reading this book and reading Kropotkin in general is the sense in which he understands, I think, the real problems of, centralization, the role of power, and the role of authority, and how, just because you call something a worker society doesn't necessarily mean it is a worker society. Right. It's much more like, you have to actually build one. It has to be, and he also talks about like there's a whole chapter, I think, that's called luxury. So, this is just like stuff you want, you know what I mean? Like that's what we're, not in the, the 19th century, you would have said like luxury. Today, you would have said like, like consumer goods or like things like that. But he's like, we need a society that does more than just feed and clothe people. Right. And we need to be a society that can produce, great art and create, things that people want and may desire. But also, like, conversely, like, luxury in and of itself, to an extent, can be an immense problem. And like a society that we build that's rooted in values of like solidarity and communism would not be one in which luxuries are something that everybody would like have like in abundance. It's not like, because you wouldn't necessarily need them, because your life would be fulfilled in other ways. This is kind of the thing about like, so in many ways it's like his critique of luxury is in many ways a critique of consumerism, where he's sort of laying out, he's like, if you buy a bunch of stuff, it's not going to necessarily make you feel better. It's not going to make you happy. Yeah. Like it's not going to, if I just get this one thing, I'm going to feel better. And his whole thing is like, well, that's not really the case. What makes most people happy is making sure that their needs are met. Yeah. And like, there's emotional fulfillment. Like, there's a lot of things that we have that we are fulfilled by that actually have nothing to do with what we buy, right? So, yeah. And so it's he also talks about how, like, obviously very similar to Marx, it's like, what the worker produces, the worker should keep. Like, it's not, and he talks about how, it's not enough to just say you have a right to work. You have to have what he calls like a right to well-being, like well-being for all. And that sort of, because, I think a lot of people are often alienated by, because Marx thought like an economist. He didn't think like a scientist. He didn't think like an anthropologist, right? So his thing was all about, building productive capacities, and then by building productive capacities, you can then wage a revolution, by sort of, by by setting the table right. And with Kropotkin, because he doesn't really think like that, his whole thing is like, well, it's got to be more than just like work. Like like everything can't just be about work.
Yeah.
It has to be about your right to live, your right to have a good life. And so that I think is also very instructive, is this desire to go beyond just sort of the basics of sort of how you would build a socialist society or a communist society.
Yeah, I quite like the way that he talks about, like, even in the late 1800s when he was writing, he talks about how the industries are currently producing such massive quantities of things that we don't actually, we don't need to work as hard if we take out the middlemen and whatnot. Like, if we remove these managerial types that are getting in the way.
Right. And then those duties would be fulfilled by people within society, which is where, this echoes a lot of what Marx would write about, especially in the Critique of the Gotha program, where it's, a society where you might work 3 or 4 hours a day at like a job that might not be particularly fun.
Right.
But then you got all this other time to do other stuff, right? So it's like, I've got an hour to go do my painting class, and then I have an hour to go and hang out with my friends at the bar. And then I have an hour to go to my local, co-op meeting and discuss what we're going to do, for the surplus or whatever. It's like, that's the thing, is it's like the whole point of building a productive society is to free our time. Because the most important element, what has really made modern society more than anything else, is time. It's the notion of time, the way you break up time. And, whether it's Marx or it's Kropotkin, their whole thing is about building a society where people get their time back.
Yeah.
Or if they don't get their time back, they get the full value of their time.
Yeah.
Their labor power, as Marx would call it. So it's about building a society where people's needs are met, but also that people can have fun. I mean, I think that's the problem. Like, people think often about socialists in general, regardless of strains, is they all think of us as being like super serious and always going to be,
yeah.
Whether it's for the good of the co-op or for the good of the party. It's like, you're always doing the thing. It's like, we have fun too. Like, it's, we enjoy life. Like, the whole reason why we have the politics we do is because we want to build a society where people can have fun, where people can have the things that they want.
Yeah. I often think of like, conversations about like rent or like landlords or what have you. And it's always like, here I come, the leftist buzzkill telling you that rent is bad.
Right. But that's what we're supposed to do. And like, that's the thing, is it's challenging base assumptions that people just think are natural. Yeah. Very much like Kropotkin in Mutual Aid, he just said, everybody just assumed that the only law of nature was competition. It's like, there is certainly competition. No, don't get me wrong. There is competition in nature, but there's also cooperation and mutual aid. Yeah. And those play a dialectical dance with each other. It's not, and it's the same with building that kind of concrete society where it's like, we say all that we say, not to be buzzkills, but to get people to think that things could actually be different, because that's the capitalist realism of it, right? The Mark Fisher thing, which we're going to do capitalist realism later in the year.
I recently listened to that as well.
Episode. So we're going to do capitalist realism in the future. The big thing is that like, we're going to do a couple other books before we get to the David Graeber book, mainly just because the David Graeber book is huge and I have to, and it's one where I'm not doing it by audiobook. I'm actually reading it. I'm making highlights in it. So I'm taking my time with it, because I think it's I actually think it's a very important book that but anyway, so, I think this is a book that, The Conquest of Bread is still a book that really resonates with people. I think it is one of the seminal texts of anarchism. It had a huge influence on the sort of the anarchist movements from the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s to the Occupy movement. Yep. Kropotkin sort of saw a resurgence during the Occupy movement. That's kind of when I learned about him, was when I was in college, I was at a bookstore in Boston on vacation with my sister-in-law and my wife, and I go into this basement, I see this, this book down there. It's like Memoirs of a Revolutionist, and it's his autobiography.
Nice.
Well, this looks kind of neat, and so, and in Mutual Aid and those other books. And I was like, okay, that's kind of when I discovered Kropotkin. And I thought, well, wow, this guy's very interesting because, I never heard of him or whatever.
Right.
But I really, and I still, do I like Mutual Aid better as a book? Probably.
Yeah.
Mainly just because it's more historical and
there's more
history minded. There's a lot more meat to Mutual Aid as a book than the Conquest of Bread. Like the Conquest of Bread is very similar to like the Communist Manifesto in that it's a primer on like his view of politics and kind of shows you in broad brush kind of his theory of change and his theory of like how you would build an anarcho-communist society. And so it doesn't have as much sort of like scholarly heft as like the Mutual Aid does. They're two. That's the thing I find very interesting about him is that like these are two very, very different books, but they're written by the same person. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's kind of exciting. But yeah, I mean, I think that people, should read the Conquest of Bread. I think people should check it out. Again, my main criticism of the book is basically like he just sort of assumes the revolution is going to happen, and I'm like, well, what would that really look like? Like, what are kind of like you've given me all the nuts and bolts of like the society you would build, but where are the nuts and bolts on like how you would get there? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of my main criticism of the book.
No, that's fair. I think there was some people have questioned like the stuff he talked about with housing and how like sometimes it seemed like he was going to like if there's he was going to force people to live together if even in order to put everybody to have housing. But yeah, I mean things were different then perhaps than right now. We have enough empty houses to fill everybody who's homeless. So right. So it's a slightly different situation, but.
For sure. Right. And it also like Marx makes them, Marx and Engels make a much more clear delineation between private property and personal property. Mm-hmm. So like private property obviously is like the stuff the capitalist owns. It's like it's the factories, it's the raw materials, it's the physical plant. Like that's right. That's private property. That's the problem.
The place where you live is
your place where you live is like, that's your private, like that's your personal property. Like your toothbrush is your personal property. Yeah. And the problem is that like Kropotkin doesn't make those neat distinctions. I think he wants things to be a lot more communal than I think even people would want them to be.
Yeah.
And so when people say like, "Oh, you're a Marxist. You want to take away my toothbrush. You want to communalize my toothbrush," and I'm like, that's actually not Marx.
No,
that's actually closer to what Kropotkin wrote.
Right.
I mean, in the sense of like, he kind of he talked about meals being held in common and housing being held in common. And it's like, some of that's kind of like more, I think idealistic. I mean, it's very much like without a doubt, like he was certainly familiar with like Robert Owen and the utopian communities in the United States. And so Robert Owen was this business owner and sort of political visionary who set up this utopian community in New Harmony, Indiana, of all places. It's about two and a half hours from where I'm at down south. And it was this utopian community where everybody lived and worked. And it was around for a few decades and then kind of disappeared. But the legacy of Robert Owen and that sort of utopian community is still very much there. And the way that system was set up is when I was reading The Conquest of Bread, I kept thinking of Robert Owen, and I'm like, oh, this is a lot like New Harmony.
Right.
Like, this is what he's trying to get to. And so I think that is a fair criticism because, quite frankly, like, I don't want to live in like a communal space. Like,
yeah, I mean, we talked about this in my local leftist book chat about how like various anarchist imaginations of how we would live, like, because free movement is paramount, right? Like, because you want to be able to move from place to place. So there's got to be housing that you can move into. And then there's people moving out of those housing. So who owns that? Where, like, is that just there and somebody's got to take care of it? Like, it's kind of various ideas about how that works, right?
Right. And it's a lot easier to do that with smaller communities, which is what I think Kropotkin had in mind. Yeah. And I guess that is another criticism I have is it's like at one point he's talking about like, the production and how, we can raise the productive forces, but then simultaneously, like, the centralization of production is a problem and this, that, and the other. I'm like, okay, well, the way to reconcile that contradiction is by building local societies where people's needs are met there. But when you go more local, you lose the centralization of production, which means the productive forces they're just not going to be as expanded as they would be in more of a centralized system.
Yeah, and he doesn't really explain how to, like, a way through that problem, right?
No, not really. And that's kind of my other criticism is it's like, I get you. I understand your critique of centralization, but, like, in order to meet people's needs, then you're going to have a certain level of that in order for it to work. Yeah. Because, how are you, unless you're going to go back down to, like, small little, like, medieval-esque hamlets where people have their little towns.
Like you say, even then, like, you have to have kind of an organizational system in place where, because various regions are going to have different materials and different things that they can produce. So you're going to be shipping back and forth, and it's going to have an organizational structure to it of some kind.
Right. And that's the thing is it's like, when you think about the sort of the world population, right? Because, like, obviously we would want to be global. So, but
right.
When you think about it, so, like, right now, like, there's nearly 7.8 billion people on the planet. Like, so you would have to meet the needs of, 7.8 million people. That's a little bit tougher to do, and in 1900, there was 1.6 billion people. So when this book was published, there was about 1.5 billion people on planet Earth. Right. So you need to make sure that 1.5 billion people on planet Earth are fed, clothed, housed, and then have a little bit of fun. Like, so those are kind of the large scale problems. And I think every revolutionary project has them.
Yeah.
And so, and I don't think, like, the thing is that, like, I don't think he's like pretending that these aren't problems. Like, I think he knows that they're problems, yeah. Right? Because the Conquest of Bread is very much like, it reads like a party platform. It's like the Communist Manifesto, right? Like, the manifesto was written as the program for the Communist League. It was written for a very specific time in 1848, yeah. During the height of the upheavals in Germany and in Europe broadly, right? It was a very specific political program for a very specific cause. And in fact, parts of the Communist Manifesto were outdated by the time Marx was an old man. And so when he wrote, right. Like, an introduction in the 1870s, like, some of this is not applicable to today. Mm. And I think some of that's true with the Conquest of Bread, where it's like, I think some of the big picture stuff's really good. Some of the specific stuff is a little like, right. Largely just as a result of like New Harmony was a very noble experiment, but, like, I would not want to live in New Harmony. Like, I would not want to live in that kind of society, quite frankly. And that's because because New Harmony was 200 years ago. Right. So, yeah. It's like, so that's the thing but I do think that the value of building sustainable systems that are local, that are independent of bigger centralized structures is, I think, a healthy thing to discuss and worthwhile. Especially in discussions of mutual aid, dual power, and so forth.
Oh, for sure.
So that is anything from you before we move on to the other one.
Yeah, I think we're pretty well covered it pretty well.
Okay. Kropotkin is someone I have a harder time talking about because I just don't know as much about him. Emma Goldman will be easier. Cool. I've written about her. I've read a lot of her work. So let's move on to talking about Emma Goldman. So Emma Goldman was an anarchist writer. She was mostly based out of the United States. Kropotkin was Russian. She was technically also Russian. She was born in the Russian Empire in a part of the world now that is the country Lithuania. Right. In 1869. She comes to the United States sort of as a young woman. And then lives in the United States for like 40 years before eventually being kicked out of the country in 1919. And then she lives in the Soviet Union for a little while. And then leaves the Soviet Union, writes a whole book about it, called My Further Disillusionment in Russia, where she basically just says, like, the Russian Revolution is not what I wanted. But to tie her to Kropotkin, when Kropotkin died in 1919, he's buried in Moscow. He's buried in Russia. And the funeral services were the last time that a major anarchist, movement met in person in what would become the Soviet Union. After that, they were all gone. They were pretty much removed. So she was there for his burial. But the thing about Emma Goldman that I think is very interesting is she brings in the dynamics of feminism. Mm-hmm. So, Kropotkin is a dude. He's not really thinking about, feminism all that much. Yeah. But she is. And she explicitly is, in many ways, a proletarian feminist as opposed to a bourgeois feminist. Yeah. And we've talked a little bit about that divide in our episode, Women, Race, and Class, the Angela Davis book. We talked about sort of the difference between bourgeois feminism, which is more rooted in sort of, the sort of liberal rights discourse, whereas proletarian feminism is much more rooted in sort of thinking through material conditions and as well as rights and sort of coming to much, I think, more substantive conclusions about how we build a society that actually emancipates women. So Goldman, her book, Anarchism and Other Essays, was originally published by her own publishing arm. It was the Mother Earth Publishing Company. Mother Earth was her magazine that she wrote regularly for. Goldman was also a very big public speaker, which is something I don't think Kropotkin was much of a public speaker. Yeah. But Emma Goldman was, and she was known for giving these sort of rollicking speeches across the United States in support of workers' rights, especially during like the Haymarket riots and other sort of workers' movements for her entire life. She died in 1940, and she's buried in Illinois. She's actually buried with some of the martyrs from the Haymarket riots in the 1880s. So the book is, I think, really great. I mean, the thing about Emma Goldman, again, kind of like Kropotkin, is so he writes like a scientist. She writes like a poet. Yeah. So it's, her stuff is not very much of like, here, if I was going to make an anarchist society, here's how I would do it. It's not really about that. She really much argues from first principles. She's sort of making the moral case for anarchy. And before we get any further, I'm going to come back to that pin that we put in, and I'd like to hear when you sort of discovered Emma Goldman and how. Yeah.
I often joke that it sounds really dumb because the first Emma Goldman quote I saw was in the show Sons of Anarchy, and it was spray painted on a wall in a tunnel of some sort, and I was like, well, that's a really good quote. I gotta find out who said that, and I gotta get into this. So then I looked it up. It was an Emma Goldman quote, and so I started reading her stuff, and I found out that she's like she was the first anarchist that I ever read, and I found out about her views on like suffrage and like her feminist views, which at the time I also kind of thought that I was kind of just getting into feminism at the same time. So it was like, this is the perfect person for me to get introduced to anarchism with. So. Right. And so, I mean, that's kind of how it is for me. So like, I kind of discovered Emma Goldman in college. I was probably like, 22, 23, read some of her stuff, and then kind of came back to her work in graduate school when I was working on my master's thesis, because one of the things I think Emma Goldman does right that I think is kind of amazing and wonderful is her critique of religion, which is something that is very specific, very pointed. So she was an atheist. She was very critical of religion. She thought that organized religions were about as bad or about as oppressive as states themselves. And so she really believed in the sort of emancipation of people from the sort of shackles of religion, especially in relationship to the way that religions treated women. Mm-hmm. So she, so the thing is that like she wrote about, she has this like really great essay called The Failure of Christianity, where she talks about sort of how Christianity developed the slave morality. Here she's sort of echoing,
sort of other previous thinkers, people like Friedrich Nietzsche and Max Stirner and others, who sort of argued for the sort of slave morality of Christianity being sort of obscene and harmful towards women. She also was like, the one thing that's very interesting about her too is that like she's not a big fan of Jesus. Generally Emma Goldman, we'll come back to her, but generally a lot of atheists will sort of say I'm not a Christian, don't believe in Christians. Jesus though, he was a pretty cool guy. And, and this is something you'll hear from all kinds of people, whether it's like Kurt Vonnegut or whatever. But her thing was basically she's she basically she said she saw his religion as, quote, the embodiment of submission, of inertia, of the denial of life, hence responsible for the things done in their name. And she sort of talks about how there's sort of three different parts of Jesus. So there's the theological Jesus, the ethical Jesus, and the poetic Jesus. And she finds all three of those lacking, quite frankly.
Right.
And she says the ethical and poetic Christ myth has so thoroughly saturated our lives that even some of the most advanced minds make it difficult to emancipate themselves from its yoke. So she basically completely rejects Jesus. She rejects Christianity.
Yeah.
She sees it all in the same boat as evil, state apparatuses that oppress the people. Because ultimately, and this is where her view of anarchism is, I think, different than Kropotkin's. Mm-hmm. So Kropotkin's anarchism is very much rooted in sort of a communitarian ethic. It's very much about everybody coming together, working together in harmony, and so on. Mm-hmm. Emma Goldman's anarchism, on the other hand, while certainly socialistic, and I think that's the case, she's very much more in the camp of that sort of American individualism, individual rights, that kind of vein, right?
Right.
And in that regard, I think she was very much influenced by anarchists in the US, like Benjamin Tucker and others who they saw their anarchism as an extension, as the sort of logical conclusion of the American Revolution. So they're if you take the principles of of the American Revolution to its logical conclusion, you will lead to an anarchist society that will fulfill people's needs, but will secure rights for all. They're you can only secure rights within a society where there is no state apparatus to oppress those who seek for their rights. And so that's a very big strain of sort of anarchist thought. Now, she's not a libertarian. I think it's that's not what I'm saying here.
Right.
But she very much has that sort of individualistic, sort of left libertarian ethos.
For sure.
So there's an essay in the book where she talks about how basically it's a critique of mass society that would not sound indistinguishable from something that a right libertarian like H.L. Mencken would have written, where it's sort of that the masses are asses and that, we need to have a society that sort of embraces and celebrates the sort of righteous, heroic individual, that a society is one that should celebrate the heroic individuals who make society go. Mm. And in that regard, if you kind of read her and you take this chunk of it out of context,
right,
it sounds like Ayn Rand. It doesn't particularly sound like something from a left winger. And I think it's because she was an immigrant, she was Jewish, she was a woman. I think that for her, this sort of celebration of the individual was an extension of celebrating her own individuality as somebody with a very unique background, somebody who was this, Russian Jew who was a woman who was saying all of these blasphemous things.
Well, yeah.
And being arrested for crimes she wasn't even involved in. When the anarchist Anton Chugach shot and killed President William McKinley in 1901, they held her for 2 weeks, and he had flat out told the authorities, I had nothing to do with that. He had told the authorities that Emma Goldman had nothing to do with this, nothing, because the thing is that during basically from the 1880s until about 1920. there was a lot of anarchist violence in the United States. Not as much as the violence that the state would go against the anarchists.
Right.
But there was some. Whether it was, Alexander Berkman, who was Emma Goldman's friend, collaborator, and lover, who shot and nearly killed Henry Clay Frick, who ran the Homestead steel mill that was owned by Carnegie. He was the Carnegie steel leader, right?
Right.
And during the Homestead strike, and tried to kill him. And again, she was sort of arrested for being a part of the conspiracy, even though she wasn't. Same with Anton Shugosh. When he killed President McKinley, they arrested her for that. She was arrested under the Comstock laws for obscenity, for, publishing obscene material in the mails. This is where you can get a sense of why she's an anarchist.
Yeah.
Is because she's so fucking fed up with people screwing with her life.
Yep, for sure.
They keep arresting her for shit that she's not doing. It has nothing to do with her, and so she just acknowledges that the state is just this brutal, repressive system that will never secure individual rights. And so the way to do that is by building a society that is devoid of the state.
Yeah.
Where we as individuals can come together and build collective societies of mutual solidarity while celebrating those who are, celebrating individuals within the system. And so that's what I think makes her interesting and different than, say, Kropotkin. She's a firebrand. I think that's kind of the big difference is if Ayn Rand is who is the left-wing Ayn Rand? It's Emma Goldman. I mean, I think that's,
right.
I think that's the way to say it, right? Because their rhetoric is very similar, but for very different ends. Because she was a socialist. It's not that she wasn't.
Right.
It's that she was also, she had no illusions about the centralization of power, which is something that both her and Kropotkin were critical of.
Yeah, for sure. So non-sequently asked which book we're talking about today. So we're talking about two books. Conquest of Bread we talked about for about 30 minutes. And then now we're also talking about Emma Goldman's Anarchism and Other Essays.
Yes. Yeah, those are the two books. And they're both, I think, incredibly important. And they're similar, but they're very, very different. The thing about Emma Goldman is she wrote very much like other people of her time. She, whether it's Eugene Victor Debs or a generation before, somebody like Robert Ingersoll or Mark Twain, they wrote things to be performed. So a lot of her essays started out as speeches where she would give a speech and then it would be a transcript. They would sell it. She would either publish that speech in Mother Earth magazine or it would be published as a separate pamphlet.
Right.
Because pamphlets during the Gilded Age, the pamphlets were sort of the social media of their time. These were cheap little pamphlets you could sell. You could make them for nothing and sell them for 5-10 cents, and you'd get your ideas across. You could sell them at street corners and so on. And people would often, someone would publish a pamphlet and then someone would write a response to that. Right. So you'll see responses to Emma Goldman or whoever. And it's kind of like somebody described it as subtweeting, where you sort of tweet and then someone does a subtweet and then you have the argument in the subtweets or whatever. It's the same thing. It's the 19th, early 20th century version of that. So a lot of her essays started out as pamphlets. The thing I know most about Goldman is her views on religion. It's what I've written about before. If you're interested in sort of more of a deep dive, on my blog, I have an essay called The Eternal Yea to Life, The Radical Humanism of Emma Goldman, which you should definitely check out to learn a little bit more. But I'm going to share a little bit more from an essay that she wrote called The Philosophy of Atheism, which is great.
Cool.
I love this. It might be my favorite thing she's ever written. But basically, it's for something written over 100 years ago, it's actually fairly prescient. There's a lot of it that's still very, very, very current and very modern. So she talks about how, the God idea is growing more impersonal and nebulous in proportion as the human mind is learning to understand natural phenomena and in the degree that science progressively correlates human and social events. It's the God of the gaps. She's laying out the God of the gaps.
Yeah, for sure.
For all to see. So what is the God of the gaps argument? So basically is religious people theists, Christians specifically, will often use sort of gaps in scientific knowledge, whether it be about cosmology, biology, whatever. They use these gaps to say, aha, so we don't know how that works. That's where God is.
Yeah.
God's in the gaps.
Yeah.
Right? But the problem is that like that becomes an ever receding pocket. Like it's because we learn more and more all the time. And as we learn more and more and more, like the gaps that God gets to fit in are much, much smaller. And, it becomes quite a snug fit in those gaps for God. And at some point we don't even need him. I mean, I would argue we don't need him now, but so she was like really ahead of the time on that. She was very much influenced by another anarchist philosopher by the name of Mikhail Bakunin. And especially his book, God and the State, which is, I think, another sort of classic, essential reading of anarchism, because he lays out very clearly the correlation between organized religion as a centralized oppressive force and the state as a centralized oppressive force against people. But basically she says that, go ahead.
Because atheism is the anarchism of religion.
Yes, it is. I mean, it very much is, right? Like it is like, and it's very logical, right? Like when we say no gods or kings, we mean it.
That's right.
Like it's not. So that was always the thing that always appealed to me with Emma Goldman was that, her anarchism was one that I could really identify with because of her explicit atheism and her humanism. For sure. That, like she advocated for what she advocated for precisely because she deeply believed in, the sort of moral worth and agency of human beings.
Yeah, that's
right. And our ability to do things better. So it's like, so she writes like, in proportion as man learns to realize himself and mold his own destiny, theism becomes superfluous. How far man will be able to find his relation to his fellows will depend entirely upon how much he can outgrow his dependence upon God. And I love that. I mean, it's really great. I mean, it's like, and at the end of, that essay, she writes, atheism in et's negation of gods is at the same time the strongest affirmation of man, and through man, the eternal yea to life, which is where I get the title of my essay, the eternal yea to life, purpose, and beauty. And it's like, I don't believe in God because I believe in humanity.
Yeah.
I don't believe in religions because I believe in human beings and our capacity to build societies where we can take care of one another. And I really love that. Like there's something very noble and very, I think, inspiring, about her view of that.
Yeah. I think like, the thing I like about Emma Goldman was like, she was never the kind, at least that I read, she was never the kind that would get hung up on the, how do we build this society question. She would go, why are you asking me how we build an anarchist society? We're anarchists. We fight for liberation. We fight for the well-being of people. That's it.
Right. And I think that's what ties her and Kropotkin together. And that's kind of the through line through the episode tonight, is that their version of anarchism was a philosophy of action. It wasn't so much about sitting around talking about highfalutin ideas. It was much more about getting into it, getting into the thick of it, and fighting to make for a better world. And I know a little bit more about Goldman, so I can speak more to her, but like that's exactly what she did. I mean, whether it was being involved in the Haymarket riots, whether it was being involved in numerous labor, strikes and activism throughout her long career in activism, her publishing work that was challenging, and but she did it.
Yeah.
I also want to come back to the feminism piece because I think that's important. So in her book, Anarchism and Other Essays, she has an essay about prostitution, which is quite good. It's a very good critique of sex work in general. And what she's saying there is that we must support and care and defend those who are sex workers, but deeply criticize a system would push people to do that without their consent. You know what I mean? Like, because that's the thing about it is, you know, I'm going to pull up the actual essay real quick, but because I think it's really, I think it's very instructive because, again, very much like the Philosophy of Atheism article, this essay that she wrote about prostitution is, I think, quite good. The essay is called The Traffic in Women. And she sort of talks about how, it's essentially, she calls it the white slave traffic. I mean, and well, I think that, you know, the limitation of the sort of just calling it white people and the problematic nature of that, because obviously there were sex workers at that time who were not white, probably quite a few of them. And so, you know, I think that's a huge problem. But she basically, like, she castigates the reformers who think that they can kind of solve this problem. Like, well, if we regulate it or if we change these kinds of things around, it'll be a little better. And her whole thing is like, no, like, you can't do that. Like, you can't fundamentally, like, really, like, you cannot really reform this system without liberation, you know, where people do this stuff because they want to, because not because they have to.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, you know, I think that's...
Yeah, I think, like, I recently released an interview I did with Caitlin Bailey from the Old Pros, and we talk about some of this, the sex work stuff. And that's by and large, like, exactly right. Like, you can't regulate this as an industry. You can't, like, the only thing you're going to end up doing is criminalizing women who are in this as a means to get ahead, as the only option other than the other coercive system.
Right.
Like, we live in a system that coerces us into labor that we don't want to do everywhere. And
all the time. And it's in the home and out. Yeah. In the job and out. Like, it's, you know, there's exploitation is exploitation, period. Yeah. It doesn't matter if it's happening through the form of sex, or if it's through the form of factory work, or it's through the form of a desk job. Like, it doesn't matter. Exploitation is exploitation. Yeah. And to kind of echo your point, here's a quote from her that she kind of says that's really good. She says, "Moralists are ever ready to sacrifice one half of the human race for the sake of some miserable institution which they cannot outgrow. As a matter of fact, prostitution is no more a safeguard for the purity of the home than rigid laws are a safeguard against prostitution. Fully 50% of married men are patrons of brothels. It is through this virtuous element that the married women, nay, even the children, are infected with venereal diseases. Yet society is not a word of condemnation for the man, while no law is too monstrous to be set in motion against the helpless victim. She is not only preyed upon by those who use her, but she is also absolutely at the mercy of every policeman and miserable detective on the beat, the officials at the station house, the authorities in every prison." It's like, yeah, like there it is, right? Yeah. Like, no amount of reform is going to make this system any better. Yeah. You know, on the whole, like, in general. So it's, you know, I think it's, again, she's making like a deeply moral argument, but also like a deeply logical one, where she's sort of laying out that, like, you know, if you cannot understand how this is exploitation as well as any other kind of exploitation, then you're in a position to, then you must be in a position to say this is wrong and that is wrong. Like, it's regardless of what career it is or what profession it is. Whether it's, you know, a blue collar profession or it's the oldest profession, you know, it doesn't matter. And so, you know, it's so she kind of, it's not that she's against like reforms. She's not. She definitely believes in some of them, especially in the ways in which we can make the system less unjust, especially towards those especially those who are victims of the system, i.e. the sort of collateral damage of people who use sex work, as well as the sex workers themselves and the conditions that they experience. Yeah. So, you know, so she, you know, she writes, she says, like, "We must rise above our foolish notions of better than thou and learn to recognize in the prostitute a product of social conditions. Such a realization will sweep away the attitude of hypocrisy and issue a greater understanding and more humane treatment. As to a thorough eradication of prostitution, nothing can accomplish that save a complete transvaluation of all accepted values, especially the moral ones, coupled with the abolition of industrial slavery.
Yeah.
So she ties them together,
Yep.
right? And that's it, And
you'll never get rid of prostitution as long as there's exploitation in every other aspect of society.
Yeah, you can't, right?
You can't do it.
This is the thing. Like it's whether and I think like her argument is so spot on, which is why like I think now I'm gonna say what I'm about to say. I'm a cis white man, so take it with a grain of salt. But here's what I'm about to say.
Okay.
So I'm not against people who are sort of pro sex work. I'm not. What I'm saying is that you have to understand that no matter how good that institution becomes within capitalism, it is still an institution within capitalism. It is still going to have exploitation. It is still going to have degradation. It is still going to have, more, an abnegation of social responsibility. All those things are still going to be part and parcel of that.
Yeah.
And so if you build the perfect, if you build the sort of anarcho-communist society of Kropotkin or whatever, and people can live how they want and people's needs are met and they want to do sex work, I think that's fine.
Yep.
Like, I don't think, but because then again, you're removing the exploitation component of it.
The coercive nature of society.
The coercive part of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's the bigger problem.
We have a comment
from
Non-Sequently. I think where I have some difficulty is that I don't think that reform should be the goal or seen as quote unquote enough, but sometimes certain, definitely not all of course, reform reduces harm until we are able to dismantle these systems. Yeah, which
that's
I think
perfect.
I think that's what Emma Goldman is kind of saying, right?
That's exactly what she's saying. You thank you for your wonderful comment. You articulated that much better than I did. So I appreciate it. I think that's absolutely right. And that's, I think, the role of us as radicals in general on the sort of, what the Trump calls it, the radical left or whatever, the anarchists, the communists.
They always make they always make us sound so cool.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, it's the inadvertent. It's like they try to make us look scary, but actually you make us look badass. Like, yeah,
that's right.
And make us look cool. But that's exactly right. So like, I think like be pro-reform, be against reformism.
Right.
I think that's the broader thing. Like, reforms are a good thing. And if you can advocate for reforms that can make people's lives a little better under the system, do it. But that cannot be the be all end all of itself. The goal should be liberation. The goal should be revolution. That should be the goal. And so, yeah, love reforms, don't love reformism. Like that's, and I think that's kind of what she's arguing in this piece.
Yep. Sounds right.
So yeah, I mean, I'm very excited about the episodes that we've done on anarchist theory. We'll certainly do more in the future, and this will be my little pitch. If there's a specific book that people know that you think is kind of a hallmark of anarchist theory that we should cover, or Marxist theory, or any kind of book you think we should cover, leave it in the comments.
That's a great idea.
Because we'll be covering a bunch of other stuff this year as well. We're going to do Trotskyism later in the year. We're going to do some more Lenin, some more Marx. We're going to do Rosa Luxemburg.
Actually, viewer Kerrigan Hayes on YouTube did recommend an anarchist book. So I'll send you a link to that.
Okay, great. Thank you. But yeah, always keep your suggestions coming, because while I do kind of have a schedule that I lay out for how, like, which ones I'm doing and when, I'm pretty flexible with some of them. Some of them I know I want to do and they're going to be the ones I do, but then other ones I'm kind of more flexible with. Sure. But yeah.
Right on. Well,
yeah.
What are we covering next time?
So next time we're doing an episode devoted to James Baldwin,
nice.
The African-American writer, who was a part of the Black freedom struggle in the 1960s. We're going to be doing two books again. We're going to be doing a book he's written and a book about him. So we're going to do The Fire Next Time, which is a book he wrote during the height of the civil rights movement. It's a collection of a couple of essays that are very, very important.
Wow.
And then the other book we're going to be doing is called Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Lessons for Our Own by Eddie S. Glaude Jr., who's a professor of African American Studies at Princeton. Begin Again is an incredible book. And we're going to be talking about the sort of James Baldwin as a witness to so much of historical importance, especially with his friendships with people like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Medgar Evers and others, right. And how those all impacted his thinking on Black liberation.
He traveled a bit too, right? Like I thought.
Yes,
he lived in a few.
Yeah, so he lived in Paris for many years. I think in like the 40s and 50s, and then came back to the United States sometime in like either the mid to late 1950s to basically be a part of the Black freedom struggle. Because he grew up in New York City and then lived abroad for a number of years. He also lived in Istanbul for a time, I think in the 60s or 70s. He died in 1987. And so, yeah, I think that, James Baldwin is one of those voices that has what Cornel West calls the prophetic fire.
Right.
And I look forward to talking a little bit about it next time.
Sounds good. So all that's left is, where can people find you?
Great. So you can find me and everything I do at justinclark.org. That's my website. So you can find all the episodes of this podcast, my blog, and also a lot of my other work. And so you can definitely check that out. I'll be having a new article coming out in the Truth Seeker magazine this summer. It's going to be our celebration of Thomas Paine issue. Another celebrated free thinker. Maybe we'll do the Age of Reason on here sometime. And that essay is about another American anarchist named Voltairine de Cleyre and the influence that Thomas Paine had on her work.
So. Awesome. So Non-Sequently had one more comment here before we go. Yeah. They said, I don't think it has anything to do with what you're doing here. You all are doing, but I'd be curious to hear what you think about Adrienne Marie Brown, emergent strategy, etc.
So I'm completely ignorant. I cannot make a comment. I don't know anything about any of that.
Yeah, me too. So,
yes. But thank you. I'll definitely look into what that is.
Yeah, for sure.
Appreciate your comment, and I'll definitely look into that.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Justin, and thank you to our viewers. And have a great one.
Thanks.
That's all, folks. Thanks for watching or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends or on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. It's really appreciated, and it helps me spend more time on this and my other projects. If you want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/skepticallefty. If you can't contribute financially, then a 5-star rating and a review on the podcast app of your choice, or on one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser or ratemypodcast.com would be great. If you want to find more from me, make sure to check out the show notes or check out my Linktree. That's linktr.ee/skepticalcory. You can find all my social media stuff there, as well as links to my other show, From Many People's Strength, which is a podcast about Saskatchewan politics, and a project I'm involved in with my friend Damien Marie at Hope that's called Atheist, Humanist, Leftist, Revolutionaries. My Twitter is @SkepticalLefty, and my Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. You can email me at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com, and if you want to be a guest on the show or know someone I should reach out to, then feel free to let me know. You can book interviews in my available time slots on my Calendly, which is also found in my Linktree. Thanks so much for listening, and let's try to make sure we're applying critical thinking and reasoned skepticism when we're attacking the system. If we get caught up in bad thinking, we can derail ourselves.